The sacrificial system that we see operating in the first century with the early the Jews before Christianity was launched with Jesus goes all the way back to Leviticus. The sacrificial system had lots and lots of rules, and you can read through it in Leviticus. And a lot of people kind of look at that and say, well, yeah, it seems kind of pagan. I think probably the best way that I know to explain it is that God instituted the sacrificial system not because that's what he would institute with anybody, but it was because he was trying to speak the language of the people of that day. And all the cultures of that day, that's kind of how they practiced religion. There was this sacrificial system. So God took these, what the early Israelites, the early Hebrews would have understood in all the other religious practices, and he shifted it for his purposes. So instead of offering these sacrifices like other pagan religions did to manipulate the gods, he said, no, offer these sacrifices to honor me as an atonement for your sin. And that became a new way of doing. He took this method and used it and shifted it for his purposes. And that stayed in place for a long time. And the people of God learned over time about God's holiness. They learned over time about the ugliness of human sin. They learned over time about the importance of obedience, and all these sorts of things. You see, even in the Old Testament, where God says, "It's not the sacrifices I want, right? It's the obedience that I want." This was just a kind of a methodology for God to help teach people. And then, with the coming of Christ, we read in Hebrews that Christ serves as the ultimate sacrifice. He shows us about the ultimate holiness of God. He shows us about how the justice of God was satisfied. He shows us about how the ugliness of sin was atoned for. All those things, that Christ is the ultimate Lamb of God. And then once he paid that ultimate sacrifice, that whole sacrificial system instituted in Leviticus is no longer relevant.